I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
The Crown briefing was supposed to last less than an hour, but everything changed the moment Catherine looked past the briefing folders and noticed a face that did not belong in the room. Charles followed her stare. William stopped speaking, and within seconds, the king ordered the entire meeting halted. What disturbed them was not simply that an advisor had entered Kensington Palace without warning, it was who had allowed him inside. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine kept her eyes on the stranger. She had seen that name before, buried on a restricted visitor list weeks earlier, and the memory hit her hard. Beside her, William noticed the change before she leaned closer and whispered, "Why is he here?" The prince did not answer. His silence was enough. This Crown briefing, a private meeting where senior royals and approved staff coordinate sensitive duties, involved engagements, family security, and communication between Kensington Palace and Buckingham Palace. An outsider was not meant to hear any of it before anyone in Kensington could react. Charles stopped the room with one movement. He removed his reading glasses, set them on the table, and looked toward the rear where the political strategy advisor had been writing by hand. The king did not shout. "No further business," he said, until someone explained who had authorized the man's presence. Catherine watched the advisor close his notebook with remarkable calm. That calm disturbed her, because he did not behave like someone who had wandered into the wrong meeting. He behaved like someone who believed he belonged there. William turned toward the two senior household officials, demanding an answer without raising his voice. One reached for the approved attendance sheet and checked the names. The prince remained rigid, while Catherine glanced again toward the closed notebook. 40 minutes before the briefing began, the advisor's name had been added electronically. More troubling still, the authorization carried the initials of someone connected to another royal household. Charles heard that detail and pushed his chair back. The monarch ordered the doors closed, while the record was checked again. Catherine felt the shock deepen as the advisor was asked to leave. Just before he stood, she noticed a briefing card, partly hidden beneath his notebook. The heading referred to a family subject never cleared for outside discussion. William followed her gaze, and the future king understood immediately why her face had changed. The stranger had been removed from the room, but Catherine's real fear began when she realized he had already seen something he was never supposed to know. Once the door closed behind the advisor, the room did not relax. It became colder. Catherine remained standing beside her chair, staring at the place where the stranger had been sitting, because she understood something the others were only beginning to grasp. This was no ordinary scheduling meeting. Several pages on that table dealt directly with William, their children, and the future shape of the monarchy. Someone had placed an outsider within touching distance of all of it. Catherine reached for the open folder and felt the violation become personal. As a senior working royal, she carried public duties on behalf of the crown. But inside Kensington, she was also a mother determined to protect George, Charlotte, and Louis from unnecessary exposure. The briefing pages contained future arrangements involving the children, including movement between residences and major family engagements. Those details mattered, because even harmless scheduling information could reveal patterns that were never meant to circulate beyond a tightly controlled group. She shut the folder and looked at William. How long was he sitting there? William did not answer immediately. The prince was caught between two responsibilities that suddenly collided: protecting his own household and remaining loyal to Charles as sovereign. A crown breach inside Kensington was therefore not simply a family problem. It touched the working relationship between the king and his heir. William wanted the person responsible brought in at once, but Charles stopped him. The monarch told his son they needed facts, before anger turned a mistake into an accusation. If someone had acted deliberately, he wanted proof. Catherine pressed both palms against the closed folder. Her voice stayed low. but the message was unmistakable. Every copy involving the children had to be found before anyone left Kensington. William immediately agreed, while Charles ordered staff to trace the advisor's route through the palace. That search produced the first disturbing answer. He had not slipped through a side entrance or talked his way past security. A palace official confirmed through the visitor record that he had entered through a legitimate checkpoint with his name already cleared. The discovery changed everything. Someone inside the royal system had opened the door for him. Catherine then learned he had arrived almost 20 minutes before Charles and had been guided directly toward the briefing area by a junior staff member who believed he was expected. William's restraint began to crack. The future king asked who had approved that instruction, and the answer led staff back to the electronic visitor log. Charles studied the record while Catherine watched his expression harden. One name appeared beside more than one of the advisor's earlier visits. A senior private secretary whose loyalty had recently become a quiet concern within royal circles. But the visitor log revealed something even worse. This was not the advisor's first appearance behind royal doors, and the previous visit pointed directly toward the incident that had started everything. 3 weeks earlier, the same advisor had already crossed a line. At the time, the incident was dismissed as an awkward scheduling mistake. The sort of quiet palace confusion nobody wanted turned into a family dispute. Catherine had not forgotten it, neither had William, and when the details were placed beside the scene at Kensington, the earlier encounter suddenly stopped looking accidental. It became the moment everyone would later recognize as the true beginning of the crisis. Catherine remembered exactly why the encounter had troubled her. Different royal households had been competing for control over public messaging, engagement schedules, charitable priorities, and access to senior members of the family, creating more pressure behind closed doors than anyone wanted to admit. A royal household simply means the staff and advisors who support a senior royal in carrying out public and private duties. Charles had already warned those teams to reduce informal outside influence because too many voices were beginning to blur one important question: who actually had authority to make decisions for the crown? William had tried to reassure Catherine before. She had told him that outsiders should never be discussing the children, the future Wales household, or decisions that affected their private family life without clear approval. The prince told her tighter procedures were being introduced, and for a time, she believed the problem had been contained. But 3 weeks before the halted briefing, she walked into a Kensington side room during preparations for an autumn royal program and stopped cold. The same advisor was there, speaking quietly with a senior secretary about whether William should be pushed to change several engagements Charles had already approved. Catherine interrupted immediately. She asked why an outside strategist was discussing the prince's schedule at all, and the advisor answered that he had only been asked for informal perspective. William later learned of the exchange and became uneasy, especially when no written authorization could be produced for that earlier meeting. The phrase sounded harmless, but the absence of paperwork mattered. In royal operations, informal advice can still shape real decisions, and once outsiders begin influencing schedules or family priorities without a clear mandate, responsibility becomes dangerously difficult to trace. Charles felt that danger now. After the Kensington room emptied, the king sat alone with the visitor records and reread the dates. His earlier instruction had not simply been misunderstood. Someone appeared to have ignored it. He circled the advisor's name on 2 separate logs, placed the pages beside each other, and saw the pattern immediately. The discovery went beyond scheduling. Staff reviewing both visits found repeated requests from the advisor for information about how decisions moved from Charles to William, who carried those instructions, and where disagreements were settled. By the time William returned to the room, Charles was no longer asking how the advisor entered Kensington. He wanted to know who had been feeding him information. The advisor was brought back into the room less than an hour later, But this time there were no briefing papers waiting for him. Only Charles, William, Catherine, and one senior secretary remained. The king did not offer him a chair. Catherine stayed silent at first, studying his face. Then Charles asked the question that transformed an uncomfortable security breach into a direct confrontation. "Who told you that you were permitted to attend this meeting?" Charles had decided there would be no quiet internal cleanup. The same outsider had now appeared twice around restricted Crown discussions, and that pattern made discretion more dangerous than confrontation. Restricted Crown discussions are meetings where only specifically approved people may hear sensitive information involving royal duties, family matters, or decisions made in the sovereign's name. William supported his father's choice, but the prince insisted Catherine remain. She had noticed both encounters, remembered the earlier warning signs, and could challenge any attempt to rewrite what had happened. The advisor held his ground. He told Charles that he genuinely believed his presence had been approved, and that he had never intended to enter a meeting without permission. The king did not soften. He told the man that belief was irrelevant when confidential royal business was being discussed. William watched closely, as the stranger repeated that he had been invited, while Catherine remained silent long enough to make the room feel even tighter. Catherine finally spoke. She reminded him of the earlier Kensington encounter and asked why, after seeing her clear objection then, he had never corrected the record or questioned whether his access was proper. Her calmness unsettled him more than anger might have. The advisor hesitated, then reached for his phone. He opened a message and handed it forward. According to that documented exchange, a senior household official had invited him directly and described the briefing as safe to observe. William recognized the name instantly. The prince's face hardened, because this was not a distant contractor or careless assistant. The official worked close to confidential coordination between royal residences, meaning the breach had come from inside the system. Charles held out his hand for the phone and read the message himself. Catherine watched him reread one line before looking toward his son. The advisor then added something worse. He had received a summary in advance, listing several subjects expected to arise in the meeting. Only a very small circle should have known those topics. Charles lowered the phone, looked directly at William, and said only 2 words: "Bring him in." The advisor had answered the king's question, but his answer created a far more dangerous one. Why would a trusted royal official deliberately place him inside the room? The senior official entered Kensington expecting a private conversation, and instead found the king waiting beside the sealed briefing folders. William stood near the window. Catherine remained seated, watching closely. There was no confusion left to hide behind. Charles had the invitation on the table, the access record in his hand, and one simple fact before him. A member of the royal machinery had decided that he could quietly expand the circle around Crown decisions without asking the Crown itself. Charles let the silence work before asking for an explanation. The official held a position that gave him access to calendars, early briefing material, and private administrative exchanges between royal households. That kind of coordination exists to keep senior royals working from the same information, but it depends far more on trust than public authority. The king knew that was exactly why this breach mattered. Someone without the power to make Crown decisions had still been close enough to influence how those decisions were discussed. The official finally defended himself. He told Charles that communication between the king's team and William's household had become strained, and he believed an outside advisor could help reduce friction before small disagreements became larger ones. William reacted immediately. The prince's jaw tightened at the suggestion that his relationship with his father required secret mediation. Catherine noticed the anger building, but she stayed silent and allowed Charles to finish. The monarch asked whether the official understood the difference between offering support and quietly inserting another voice into private royal business. The answer made the room heavier. The official admitted, in a recorded internal account of the meeting, that he had shared sanitized summaries with the advisor before. He insisted those summaries were stripped of deeply private details and were meant only to provide context. Charles did not accept the distinction so easily. The king asked one question: had any information concerning George, Charlotte, or Louis ever appeared in those summaries? Catherine saw the truth before the words came. The official hesitated. Then he admitted that children's scheduling information may have appeared in one briefing summary. Her expression changed at once. She closed her eyes for a moment, then looked directly at him. "That was never yours to share." William turned away briefly, trying to control his anger, while Charles remained completely still. The king ended the discussion with a decision. He removed the official from all briefing access pending a full review and ordered every shared summary traced. Yet Catherine noticed something troubling in William's reaction. The prince did not look relieved. He looked worried, because if information had already been sent outside Kensington, nobody yet knew where it had gone next. The king had finally identified who opened the door, but the damage inside Kensington was already moving outward, and the first consequences arrived before sunset. By evening, Kensington Palace felt different. Security lists were rewritten, staff passes were checked, briefing folders disappeared into locked cabinets, and meetings scheduled for the next morning were suddenly postponed. Yet the deepest change was not administrative. Catherine returned to her private rooms, knowing that information concerning her family had traveled farther than she had been told. The palace could revoke access in minutes. Restoring trust would take far longer. Charles acted before the damage could spread further. The king ordered a temporary freeze on non-essential outside advisors, attending internal crown meetings across connected royal households. An internal crown meeting is a restricted discussion where senior royals and approved staff handle duties, schedules, security, and private family matters. William responded just as firmly. The prince instructed Kensington staff to review 6 weeks of guest access, copied briefing pages, and electronic distribution lists, because the problem was no longer one unauthorized chair in one room. They needed to know how far the habit had already reached. Catherine grew quieter as the hours passed. Alone with William, she admitted that public embarrassment was not what frightened her most. What hurt was the casual way their children had been included in conversations they never approved. George, Charlotte, and Louis had become lines inside summaries passed between adults who had convinced themselves that convenience was enough justification. The prince listened without interrupting, then admitted his own regret. He should have challenged the earlier incident more forcefully instead of trusting new procedures to close the gap. The audit delivered the answer neither of them wanted. A documented internal review showed that the advisor had received 3 separate summaries. 2 contained routine information, but the third included references to future family arrangements involving the Wales children. Nothing inside amounted to a catastrophic state secret, yet that almost made the discovery worse. William realized the breach had not grown from one dramatic act of betrayal. It had grown slowly, through people sharing information because it seemed useful, easy, and harmless. Catherine opened the children's schedule again. She removed a duplicate copy, tore it into pieces herself, and placed the original inside a locked drawer, while William watched in silence. That simple act carried more weight than any argument. The princess was drawing a boundary that should never have needed defending. Late that night, Charles called his son privately. The king did not mention the advisor or the suspended official. His voice was calm, but the message was final. "Come alone tomorrow morning," he told William. "We need to decide what changes now." The breach had exposed a weakness in palace procedure, but Charles's next conversation with William would reveal that he believed something deeper had to change between father and son. There were no secretaries inside the room the next morning, no advisors, no briefing folders, and no officials waiting beyond the table. Charles had asked William to come alone, because the crisis had stripped away something they normally relied upon: layers of people carrying messages between them. For the first time since the advisor was discovered inside Kensington, the king and his heir faced the real problem directly. Too many people had begun speaking between them instead of allowing them to speak to each other. Charles did not begin with blame. The king told his son that the unauthorized advisor had only gained influence because communication between their households had become too dependent on intermediaries. Those intermediaries are staff members who carry instructions, schedules, and decisions between senior royals. But they are never meant to replace direct authority. William understood the point immediately. As both men had taken on heavier responsibilities, staff coordination had expanded, and with that growth came a dangerous space where officials could start interpreting messages instead of simply passing them on. William admitted that the system had become too complicated. The prince had trusted experienced staff to keep Kensington aligned with the sovereign's office, while Charles had trusted his own team to do the same. Somewhere between those two sides, people had begun making judgments neither man had asked them to make. The king confessed that he felt undermined when he learned an official believed father and son needed outside mediation. William answered just as firmly. He felt insulted by the idea that his household needed to be managed from behind closed doors. The conversation changed when William brought Catherine into it. The future king told his father that involving George, Charlotte, and Louis had crossed a line no administrative explanation could repair. This was no longer only about process, it was about family trust. Charles agreed. The monarch then proposed a new arrangement. Sensitive matters involving succession, family roles, or the Wales children would first be discussed directly between the principals of both households before any wider briefing. Succession, in simple terms, means the order determining who is expected to inherit the crown. Charles poured 2 cups of tea himself and pushed one toward his son. "We should have been speaking directly before someone else decided to do it for us." William accepted the cup, then added one condition: the advisor and the official who authorized him must permanently lose access to private Wales family material. The king agreed without hesitation. The decision gave father and son something they had lacked throughout the crisis: a united response. But their private agreement came just as details of the halted Kensington briefing began moving beyond palace walls. The father and son had finally closed the gap between them. But outside the palace gates, the public was about to discover why the crown briefing had abruptly stopped. By midday, what had begun inside a closed room at Kensington was no longer private. Television crews appeared outside the gates. Reporters began comparing staff movements, cancelled meetings, and the unusual silence from royal offices. The public did not know every detail, but one image captured the atmosphere perfectly. Catherine leaving Kensington beside William, composed but unsmiling, only hours after the crown briefing had been stopped, because she noticed someone who was never meant to be there. Charles knew silence could no longer carry the palace through the day. His office confirmed that an internal meeting had been interrupted, because attendance procedures had not been followed, while refusing to expose private family material. Attendance procedures, in simple terms, are the rules that decide who is cleared to enter sensitive royal meetings and what information they may hear. The king also ordered tighter controls on briefing access, showing that the monarchy intended to act before speculation became stronger than the facts. Catherine became the emotional center of the story almost immediately. Public sympathy gathered around her because she had noticed the breach herself, but privately, she disliked being turned into a dramatic whistleblower. Her concern had never been attention, it had been the boundary around her family. William understood that, and when they appeared together outside Kensington, the prince stayed close, as questions came from behind the barriers. He briefly placed a hand at her back, a quiet sign that he knew how much pressure had fallen on her. The pressure intensified when royal correspondents learned that the advisor held no formal crown role. That detail mattered because it destroyed the easiest explanation. He was not a permanent official who had wandered into the wrong room. He was an outsider who had somehow reached a restricted briefing with enough confidence to sit, listen, and take notes. William knew the public would now ask the same question Charles had asked behind closed doors. Who believed they had the right to put him there? The story exploded the next morning. A major London paper ran the gates of Kensington across its front page beneath the headline, "Who Let Him In?" Broadcasters repeatedly replayed footage of Charles leaving after the halted meeting, while commentators focused on the apparent failure of internal controls. Catherine paused for barely a second when a reporter called out, asking whether she felt betrayed. She gave no answer. She looked toward William, and the two continued together. The spectacle outside Kensington would eventually fade, but Charles knew the monarchy would be judged by what remained after the cameras disappeared. The final decision came without ceremony. There was no dramatic announcement from a palace balcony, and no public punishment staged for cameras. Instead, Charles signed a revised briefing protocol that permanently removed the unauthorized advisor from Crown access, transferred the senior official who invited him away from confidential coordination, and created a direct channel between himself, William, and Catherine for sensitive family matters. The crisis ended where it began, with one simple principle restored: nobody enters the royal family's private decisions without permission. Charles made the new boundary impossible to misunderstand. The king required named authorization for every outsider entering meetings involving family strategy, succession, or private schedules. A briefing protocol is simply the set of rules controlling who may attend sensitive meetings and what information they are allowed to receive. William and Catherine also gained tighter control over material involving Kensington and their children. The informal culture that had allowed useful information to drift beyond its proper circle was finished. From now on, convenience would never be enough. Catherine felt relief, but not because someone had been punished. She told William privately that noticing the advisor when she did might have prevented something far more serious later. The prince understood exactly what she meant. Their children's information had not been stolen in some dramatic act. It had been treated too casually, and that was precisely what made the breach dangerous. For Catherine, the new rules meant the boundary she had defended was no longer based on trust alone. It was finally written into procedure. Charles also accepted a harder truth. The monarch understood that the crisis had exposed a weakness in leadership as much as a failure by one official. Too many intermediaries had been allowed to stand between royal households, and some had begun confusing proximity with authority. The final internal investigation, recorded in a documented review, found no stolen files and no larger conspiracy. The advisor had not secretly seized crown material. The real danger was quieter. One trusted official had normalized unauthorized access because he believed efficiency justified crossing a line. The consequences were permanent. The advisor lost access to confidential crown briefings. The official who invited him was removed from sensitive family coordination. The information-sharing system was rebuilt, while William, Catherine, and Charles began speaking directly on matters too important to pass through layers of interpretation. Days later, Charles entered another crown briefing and checked every person himself. The king nodded toward William, and the prince began. Catherine opened her folder without hesitation. Nothing dramatic happened, and that was the point. What began with one unfamiliar face inside Kensington ended with the royal family drawing a firm line around trust, family, and authority. And this time, Charles made certain that line could not quietly be crossed again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.